The cold seeped through the thin soles of her slippers, a phantom chill that had nothing to do with the polished marble floor and everything to do with the eyes that watched her. Every whisper was a sharpened stone, every smirk a physical blow against her spirit. The great hall of the Northern King was a cavern of judgment, its vaulted ceilings echoing with the silent laughter that followed her steps. Tessara Wynne kept her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the stone ahead, her hands clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles were white stars against her pale skin. She could feel the weight of her own body, the gentle swell of her hips, and the softness of her belly, the very curves they had always scorned, as a leaden burden. They called her unfit, a disgrace to the lean predatory forms of the Denmore court, and now she was their spectacle. This was her punishment, orchestrated by the man whose cruel pride she had dared to defy. Alpha Valerius, her former pack leader, had brought her here not for justice, but for annihilation. Her crime? Shielding a frightened, newly turned pup from his drunken rage, placing her own unworthy Omega body between his snarling wolf and the child. An act of instinct, of protection. To Valerius, it was an unforgivable act of insubordination. He had promised to make her regret it, to show her what a worthless, barren Omega truly was. His solution was this: a ritual humiliation before the alpha of all alphas, the scarred and fearsome King Alaric Denmore. She was to be presented as a joke, a cautionary tale. This is what happens when the weak forget their place. The air grew thinner, colder as they neared the throne, and with every step, a primal fear warred with a stubborn, flickering ember of defiance deep within her. They could break her body, but she would not let them devour her soul. The final, terrible moment was upon her, the moment her shame would be sealed by royal decree. The guards at her side shoved her forward, a rough, final push that sent her stumbling into the vast, empty space before the dais. She caught her balance, her worn wool dress swirling around her ankles. The whispers crescendoed for a moment and then fell into a breathless, expectant hush. It was a predator's silence, the quiet that descends upon the forest just before the kill. Tessara forced herself to breathe, the air tasting of cold iron, wood smoke, and something else, something wild and primal that emanated from the throne itself. Pine and winter storm, and the metallic tang of old blood. It was the scent of power, of the king. Valerius stepped forward, his voice a smug, oily sound that filled the cavernous hall. "My king," he began, bowing with a flourish that was more arrogance than respect. "I bring before you the Omega Tessara, of my pack. She has forgotten her station. She defied a direct command from her alpha." He gestured to her, a flick of his wrist that dismissed her entire being. "As you can see, she is soft, ill-suited for the rigors of pack life. We thought it fitting that her final judgment come from you, as a lesson to all who might harbor such defiance." The assembled courtiers, all sharp angles and predatory grace, tittered with amusement. The words soft and ill-suited were barbs coated in honeyed poison. They were talking about her body, her curves that defied the wiry, battle-ready physique of the northern she-wolves. In a land where every wolf was a warrior, her gentle fullness was seen as a weakness, a sign of indolence, a flaw in the bloodline. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of shame so potent it threatened to suffocate her. She refused to look at them. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her tears. Instead, she did the one thing she was not supposed to do. She lifted her head. Her gaze traveled past the smirking face of Valerius, over the gleaming, merciless faces of the court, and finally to the man seated upon the throne of carved obsidian and weirwood. The whispers had not done him justice. King Alaric Denmore was not a man. He was a force of nature carved into human form. He was immense, his broad shoulders filling the high-backed throne, his presence a physical weight in the room. A web of old scars traced a path from his temple down his jaw, a testament to a life of brutal conflict. His hair was the color of shadow, thick and untamed, and his eyes were not the cold gray of the northern sky, but the incandescent silver of a star about to go nova. They were ancient, intelligent, and utterly devoid of the petty amusement that danced in the eyes of his subjects. He was not looking at Valerius. His entire, terrifying focus was on her. The moment their gazes locked, the world fractured. The cold hall, the whispering nobles, the scent of smoke and stone, it all vanished, burned away by a sudden, impossible heat that coiled low in her belly. It was not a blush of shame, but a flash fire of recognition, a primal shock that jolted through her blood and bone. Her inner wolf, a creature so subdued and silent she sometimes forgot it was there, surged forward with a desperate, yearning howl that only she could hear. It was a sensation she had never known, a magnetic pull so powerful it rooted her to the spot, stealing the very breath from her lungs. She saw a flicker in those silver eyes, a widening of his pupils. He leaned forward slightly, a subtle shift that nonetheless sent a ripple of unease through the court. His nostrils flared, and she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he was tasting her scent on the air. Not just the faint smell of soap and wool, but her true scent. The one hidden beneath layers of omega submission and shame, rain-soaked earth and wild heather, the scent of life. Valerius, oblivious, droned on. "She is barren, my king, a drain on resources. We ask your permission to exile her to the withered lands, where her softness will find its proper end." Exile was a death sentence, but Tessara barely heard him. She was trapped in the king's gaze, in the silent, ferocious conversation passing between them. He saw her, not the unfit Omega, not the soft disgrace. He saw her. The intensity of his stare was a physical touch, stripping away her defenses, laying bare the core of her being. She felt the hidden strength she'd clung to, the defiant act that brought her here, rise to the surface not as a crime, but as a point of pride. His gaze did not condemn it. It seemed to acknowledge it. A low growl rumbled in the king's chest, a sound so deep and resonant it vibrated through the marble floor. It was not a sound of anger, but of possession. The hall fell into a dead, frightened silence. Every courtier froze, their smirks wiped clean from their faces, replaced by stark disbelief and a dawning fear. They had never heard that sound directed at anyone but a mortal enemy on the battlefield. King Alaric rose from his throne. He moved with a fluid, lethal grace that belied his size, descending the few steps of the dais. He didn't spare a single glance for the stunned Valerius. His silver eyes never left Tessara's. Each step he took toward her was a beat of a war drum, echoing the frantic, wild pounding of her own heart. The air crackled with a tension so thick it was a living thing, a storm about to break. He stopped a mere foot from her, close enough that she had to crane her neck to look up at him, close enough that his sheer heat washed over her skin. The scent of him was overwhelming now, pine and storm and the clean, sharp scent of an apex predator. It called to something deep within her, an instinct she never knew she possessed. It wasn't fear that held her paralyzed, but a breathless, terrifying awe. "Your name," he commanded. His voice was a low thunder, a gravelly sound that resonated in her very bones. She found her own voice, surprised when it emerged not as a whisper, but as a clear, steady tone. "Tessara Wynne, my king." He tilted his head, his gaze sweeping over her, from the flush on her cheeks to the curve of her hips and back again. It wasn't a leering glance like those she had suffered 1,000 times before. It was an assessment, an appreciation, a claiming. Valerius, finally sensing his perfect humiliation ceremony, had gone terribly wrong, found his courage. "Your Majesty, this is the Omega I spoke of. She is nothing, a mistake. Allow me to remove her from your sight." He took a step forward, reaching for Tessara's arm. He never touched her. With a speed that was impossibly fast, the king's hand shot out, not to strike Valerius, but to gently, possessively, cup the side of Tessara's neck. His thumb rested on the pulse point just below her ear, his touch a brand of scorching heat against her cold skin. A jolt of pure energy, golden and white-hot, shot through her. It was the bond, flaring to life like a newborn star. Raw, untamed, and undeniable. Her knees went weak, and she swayed, her entire being screaming a single shocking word. "Mine." King Alaric's silver eyes blazed, locking onto Valerius's horrified face. A predatory smile, cold and sharp, touched his lips. "You brought me a gift, little Alpha," the king purred, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper that carried to every corner of the silent hall. "But you are mistaken." His thumb stroked her pulse, a gesture of ownership so blatant it was an act of war. "She is no mistake." His gaze returned to Tessara, pinning her, claiming her, sealing her fate in front of the entire stunned court. "She is my queen." A collective strangled gasp sucked the air from the great hall. The king's words hung in the sudden, absolute silence, more shocking than a thunderclap, more binding than any law. My queen. 2 words that shattered 1,000 years of tradition. 2 words that had just become Tessara's reality and her cage. The heat of his hand on her neck was the only thing holding her upright. An anchor in a world that had tilted off its axis. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the deep, steady rumble of the growl still vibrating in his chest. Valerius stared, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief. The smug cruelty drained away, replaced by a pasty, sickly pallor. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. He looked from the king's unyielding face to Tessara, his eyes suddenly filled with a venomous hatred so pure it was terrifying. He had brought her here to be destroyed, and instead, he had delivered her to a throne. "You," King Alaric said, his voice dropping to a deceptively soft tone, though his silver eyes remained fixed on Valerius. "Look at me when I speak to you." Valerius flinched as if struck, his gaze snapping back to the king. "You brought what is mine into my hall and called her nothing," Alaric continued, the words spaced with lethal precision. "You offered her up for judgment. Here, then, is my judgment." He leaned in, his voice a whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. "Leave my sight, and if your shadow ever falls upon her again, if you even think her name, I will not exile you. I will scatter your ashes to the 4 winds myself." It was not a threat. It was a promise. A shiver of pure terror rippled through the assembled court. Valerius stumbled back, his face ashen. He bowed, a jerky, broken movement, and practically fled the hall, the sound of his hurried footsteps echoing his humiliation. With Valerius gone, Alaric finally turned his full attention back to Tessara. The possessive fire in his eyes softened. Just a fraction, but the intensity remained. His thumb stroked her pulse again, a soothing, hypnotic rhythm that calmed the frantic fluttering in her chest. "Come," he said, the word a command wrapped in velvet. He did not release her. Instead, his hand slid from her neck to the small of her back, a solid proprietary weight that guided her forward. He led her from the dais, and as they moved, the frozen court parted before them like a river cleaving around a great stone. The whispers started again, no longer mocking, but laced with shock, awe, and fear. She could feel their eyes on her, 100 burning points of scrutiny, but the king's presence was a shield, a storm wall that kept the world at bay. She walked in his shadow, breathing in his scent, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a strange, terrifying sense of safety. They left the great hall and moved through corridors of dark, polished stone and heavy tapestries, depicting ancient hunts and forgotten battles. Guards in black and silver armor snapped to attention as they passed, their impassive faces betraying nothing. But Tessara could feel their curiosity. This was the king's domain, a place of power and shadow she had never imagined she would see. Every step took her further from the life she knew, a life of submission and quiet endurance, and deeper into an unknown, dangerous future. He led her to a massive set of iron-bound oak doors. He pushed one open, and the scent from within washed over her. More of him, but deeper, mingled with the smell of burning birchwood, old leather, and the crisp, clean air of the northern night. These were his private chambers, his den. The room was vast, dominated by a hearth so large a man could stand inside it. A fire roared, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Furs, wolf, bear, and snowcat were draped over heavy, carved wooden furniture. Shelves overflowed with books and scrolls, and a massive table was littered with maps marked with strategic positions. A set of doors stood open to a stone balcony, letting in a draft of wind that carried the scent of pine and distant snow. It was a space of raw, masculine power, a fortress and a sanctuary, all in one. He guided her toward the fire, finally releasing her. The sudden loss of his touch left her skin feeling cold and strangely empty. She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive posture she had held for a lifetime. He watched her, his silver eyes seeming to absorb the very light from the fire. "You are afraid," he stated, not unkindly. Tessara found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. I don't understand." This is a mistake. I am an Omega. I am nothing of what he said, but I am not a queen. The title felt like a foreign word in her mouth, a costume that didn't fit. What he said is the reason you are a queen, Alaric countered, his voice rumbling with conviction. He called you soft. I see a strength that allowed you to stand against an alpha for a pup you did not know. He called you unfit. My wolf says otherwise. He took a step closer, and her inner wolf, which had been pacing restlessly, rose up with a powerful surge of recognition, of welcome. Mate. The word echoed in the deepest part of her soul. The bond, she breathed, the realization dawning on her. It's the mating bond. It was the stuff of legends, a fated connection so rare it was spoken of in whispers, dismissed by most as a myth. It is, he confirmed. The moment you entered the hall, I scented it. The moment our eyes met, I knew. It is why my wolf recognized you. It is why yours calls to mine. He tilted his head, studying her with an unnerving perception. You have kept your wolf quiet for a long time. Shame washed over her. I had to. An Omega's wolf is a liability. It must be managed. It was a truth she had learned through harsh lessons and cruel words. Her instincts, her very nature, had been things to be suppressed. Not here, Alaric said, his voice firm. Not with me. In my kingdom, strength comes in many forms. The strength to endure is as valuable as the strength to fight. He moved to a small table and poured 2 goblets of a deep red wine. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers. The contact sent another jolt of that golden fire through her veins, warming her from the inside out. Her hand trembled as she took the goblet. She took a hesitant sip. The wine was rich and warm, chasing away some of the lingering chill. He watched her over the rim of his own goblet, his gaze never leaving her face. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. It wasn't an awkward silence, but a heavy, expectant one. Why, she finally asked, the question that had been screaming in her mind. Why say it, in front of everyone? You could have simply taken me. You are the king. A flicker of something, regret perhaps, or weariness, crossed his scarred features. Because my court is filled with vipers and schemers, they respect only one thing, absolute, undeniable power. To have taken you quietly would have marked you as a weakness, a concubine, a toy. They would have tried to destroy you in the shadows. His eyes hardened. By naming you queen, I made you untouchable. I declared you my equal in station, if not yet in power. An attack on you is an attack on me. An insult to you is treason. They understand that language. She stared into the fire, the flames dancing in her eyes. It was a brutal, terrifying logic. But she understood it. He had not just claimed her, he had built a fortress of rank and title around her with 2 words. I don't know how to be a queen, she confessed, her voice thick with insecurity. I will teach you, he said simply, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. He set his goblet down and closed the distance between them. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Gently, he took her free hand, his large, calloused palm enveloping her smaller one. You already have the heart of one, Tessara. You have courage. You have compassion. The rest is merely learning the steps to a dance you were born to lead. He lifted her hand, turning it over to study her palm. His thumb traced the lines there, a feather-light touch that sent shivers up her arm. His head was bowed, the firelight catching the silver strands in his dark hair. For the first time, she saw not just the fearsome king, but the man, a man burdened by his crown, surrounded by enemies, and perhaps deeply lonely. There is more, he said, his voice low and serious. He finally lifted his head, his silver eyes boring into hers, filled with a gravity that stole her breath. It is not just the bond. There is a prophecy, an old one, spoken by the moonseers generations ago. He paused, and the air grew thick with unspoken history, with the weight of destiny. They spoke of a time when the northern packs would be threatened by a creeping blight from the withered lands, a corruption that starves the soil and poisons the bloodline. They said the only one who could heal the land and unite the packs would be a queen brought to the king's hall in shame, an Omega queen, with the scent of rain-soaked earth and wild heather. Tessara's goblet slipped from her nerveless fingers. crashing to the stone floor and shattering in a spray of dark red wine that looked like blood in the firelight. Her scent. He was talking about her. It wasn't just a bond, it was fate. A terrible, heavy, magnificent fate. Alaric didn't even glance at the shattered glass. His gaze held hers, intense and unwavering. He stepped closer still, cupping her face with his free hand, his touch surprisingly gentle against her skin. "You were not brought to me as a joke, Tessara," he murmured, his voice a low, possessive growl that vibrated through her soul. "You were brought to me as a promise." The world narrowed to the sound of shattering glass and the scent of spilled wine, dark and earthy against the stone. A promise. The word echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of the chamber, heavier than any crown. Tessara stared at the crimson splash on the floor, her mind reeling. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't a chance encounter. It was destiny, a path laid out in prophecies and whispers long before she was born. The fragile sense of self she had so carefully guarded, the quiet dignity she had maintained in the face of scorn, felt like a house of cards in a hurricane. She was not Tessara Wynne, the disgraced Omega. She was a symbol, a key, a sacrifice waiting to be made. Alaric's hands were still cupping her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones, his touch the only solid thing in her spinning reality. His silver eyes searched hers, demanding she see what he saw. Not a burden, but a purpose. "I know this is a great deal to comprehend," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But you are not alone in this. I have waited for you, Tessara. My kingdom has waited for you." His certainty was a terrifying, suffocating comfort. She wanted to believe him, to lean into the strength he offered. But a lifetime of being told she was worthless was a formidable barrier. "They will never accept me," she whispered, the words tasting of ash. "The court, they saw me brought here in shame. They see an Omega. They will only ever see a weakness at your side." "Then let them look," he growled, a possessive fire igniting in his gaze. "They will see you through my eyes, or they will be blinded. I will burn this court to the ground before I let them harm you." He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers, and she could feel the raw power thrumming through him, a controlled inferno. Through the bond, she felt a wave of his fierce, unwavering conviction. It was a promise of protection so absolute it felt like its own form of chains. A golden cage, just as she'd feared. He did not press her further that night. He simply led her to an adjoining chamber, a room fit for the queen he had named her. A fire was already blazing in the hearth, chasing the chill from the stone walls. The bed was a mountain of furs and soft linens, and the air was scented with dried lavender and cedar. It was more luxury than she had known in her entire life, and it felt utterly alien. He paused at the door, his large frame filling the archway. "Rest," he commanded softly. "Tomorrow you will not face them as the Omega they scorned. You will face them as who you are." His eyes held hers for a long moment, a silent vow passing between them before he turned and left, the heavy door closing with a soft, final click. Sleep did not come easily. She lay in the vast, empty bed, drowning in silk and doubt, the king's words and the court's mocking whispers warring in her mind, until the gray light of dawn finally broke through the tall, arched window. She was woken by a soft knock. An older she-wolf entered, her face a mask of stern neutrality. She was tall and wiry, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe braid, her movements economical and precise. "I am Marin," she announced, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "I have been tasked with attending you." She and two younger servants brought with them an array of gowns in shades of deep forest green, charcoal gray, and a startling, brilliant silver, the colors of the Denmore royal house. Tessara stared at them, her hand instinctively going to the worn, brown wool of the dress she still wore. It was the only thing left of her old life. "The king has requested your presence in the great hall for the morning meal," Marin stated, her eyes flicking over Tessara with a critical, assessing gaze. It wasn't the open contempt of the courtiers, but it was far from welcoming. It was the look of someone reserving judgment. "You will wear this." She indicated the silver gown. It was exquisite, the fabric shimmering like moonlight on water, the sleeves lined with soft white fur. It was a gown of power, a queen's gown. Dressed in the borrowed finery, Tessara felt like an imposter. The silver fabric was cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the familiar warmth of wool. The cut of the dress did not hide her curves but accentuated them, the fabric clinging to her hips and bust in a way that was both elegant and bold. When Marin finished arranging her hair, letting it fall in soft waves down her back, Tessara looked at her reflection in the polished silver mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The fear was still in her eyes, but there was something else now, a shadow of the power Alaric saw in her. When she was ready, Alaric was waiting for her outside the chamber door. He was dressed in black leather and gray wool, a silver circlet the only sign of his station. His eyes swept over her, a slow, appreciative appraisal that sent a flush of heat across her skin. He offered her his arm, and the moment she placed her hand on his forearm, the bond between them hummed, a current of silent communication and shared strength. Walking into the great hall on his arm was an entirely different experience. The mocking whispers were gone, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Every noble, every courtier turned to stare. Their bows were stiff, their faces masks of forced deference. Tessara could feel their resentment, their shock, their burning curiosity. It was a tangible thing, a wall of hostility that she had to walk through. But Alaric's presence was an impenetrable shield. He moved as if he owned the world, his gaze daring anyone to show a hint of disrespect. He led her not to the long tables where the court ate, but to the dais, to a smaller, more intimate table set for two, directly before the empty throne. The message was clear. She was not one of them. She was above them. The meal was a tense affair. Servants moved with silent, nervous energy. The court ate, but their attention was fixed on the royal table. Alaric spoke to her in a low voice, telling her about the lands visible from the high windows, pointing out the peaks of the Frostfang Mountains. He was trying to put her at ease, to build a small, private world for them amidst the sea of watching eyes. Tessara responded in monosyllables, her senses on high alert, every nerve ending screaming. The food was rich, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. It was then that the doors to the great hall boomed open, a stark interruption to the strained quiet. Every head turned. Tessara's heart seized in her chest. Framed in the archway, flanked by two of his most loyal pack members, stood Alpha Valerius. He was no longer the smug, preening Alpha who had brought her here for humiliation. His face was pale, his eyes burning with a feverish, desperate light. He looked like a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. A low growl started in Alaric's chest, a deep, predatory rumble that made the goblets on their table vibrate. His hand instinctively covered hers on the table, his grip possessive and crushing. "You dare show your face in my hall?" Alaric's voice was deceptively calm, but it sliced through the silence like a shard of ice. Valerius strode forward, his steps echoing with a chilling, defiant confidence. He stopped at the foot of the dais, his eyes ignoring the king to fix on Tessara. The hatred in his gaze was a physical blow. "I do not come to defy my king," he said, his voice ringing with false piety. "I come to save him, to save our kingdom." The court erupted in murmurs. This was theater of the highest order. "You speak of saving me from the queen I have chosen?" Alaric rose slowly from his seat, his full height a terrifying spectacle of contained rage. He was a storm about to break. "I speak of saving you from a flawed vessel for a sacred prophecy," Valerius shot back, his voice rising. "Yes, the bond is real. I do not deny what the moon has fated, but the fates can be cruel. They can give with one hand and take with the other. They have given you a mate, my king, but they have given you a barren omega." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Tessara flinched, the old shame washing over her, hot and suffocating. "She cannot bear you a true alpha heir," Valerius continued, pressing his advantage as he saw the flicker of doubt on the faces of the court. "She is soft, untested. The prophecy speaks of a queen who will heal the land, not an omega who will weaken the royal bloodline forever. How can we be sure she is the one? How can we risk the entire future of the North on a feeling, a scent?" "You are trying my patience, Valerius," Alaric snarled, taking a step toward the edge of the dais. "Am I?" Valerius cried, raising his hands. "Or am I voicing the fear that is in everyone's heart? The law is clear, the traditions are ancient. A potential queen, especially one whose coming is so irregular, must be proven worthy. He dropped to one knee, a gesture of submission that was, in reality, an act of pure aggression. He had trapped the king. By ancient law, Valerius declared, his voice booming in the now silent hall. As the alpha who brought the candidate before the throne, I have the right to demand proof of her worth. I demand she face the trial of the Moonstone. A collective gasp went through the hall. Marin, standing near a pillar, went pale. Even Alaric froze, the rage in his eyes momentarily replaced by a flicker of disbelief and cold fury. He was cornered, not by force, but by the very laws he was sworn to uphold. All eyes turned to Tessara. She sat there, pinned by the weight of their stares, the name of the unknown trial tolling like a funeral bell in her mind. Valerius had not come for a fight. He had come for a sacrifice, and he had just placed the knife in her own hand. The silence in the great hall was a living entity, a coiled serpent waiting to strike. Every breath was held, every eye fixed upon the dais. Tessara felt as though she had been turned to stone, the silver gown a cold, heavy skin. Trial of the Moonstone. The words meant nothing to her, but she could read their meaning in the sudden, sharp intake of breath from the court, in the flicker of true, unveiled horror in the eyes of the nobles who had been smirking only moments before. She saw it most of all in Alaric. The blazing rage in his eyes was banked, replaced by a cold, deadly stillness that was infinitely more terrifying. He was a predator frozen mid-strike, trapped not by a cage of iron, but by the invisible, unyielding bars of his own law. Valerius remained on one knee, his head bowed in a mockery of respect, but Tessara could see the triumphant glint in his eyes. He had done it. He had found the one weapon the king could not counter: tradition. He had used the ancient ways of their people to put a leash on their sovereign. Alaric could kill him where he knelt. The raw power rolling off him in waves promised as much. But to do so would be to defy the very laws that gave him his throne. It would prove Valerius's point, that the king's judgment was clouded, his actions ruled by a rogue bond rather than royal duty. He would make Alaric a tyrant in the eyes of his people to save her. And in that horrifying, crystal-clear moment, Tessara understood. As long as she was something to be protected, she would be his weakness, his Achilles' heel. Valerius had not aimed his arrow at her. He had aimed it at the king, using her as the bow. A strange calm settled over her, chilling and absolute. The frantic terror receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She had spent her life being pushed, judged, and discarded. She had been a pawn in Valerius's games, a spectacle for the court's amusement, and now a vulnerability for the king she was fated to rule beside. No more. Slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet. The whisper of silver fabric was the only sound in the hall. Alaric's hand, which still covered hers, tightened, a silent plea, a warning. She gently pulled her hand free from his. She felt his shock through the bond, a jolt of confusion and fear that was entirely for her. She looked down from the dais, her gaze sweeping over the sea of hostile, waiting faces, before finally landing on the kneeling form of Valerius. She lifted her chin, and for the first time in her life, she did not try to hide her curves, her softness. She stood in them, owned them. "I accept the trial," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the unnatural silence with perfect clarity. It was steady, unwavering. 100 different emotions flickered across the faces in the crowd: shock, disbelief, a new, grudging respect, and from some, a dark, hungry anticipation. Valerius's head snapped up, his feigned humility gone, replaced by pure, predatory victory. This was exactly what he wanted. Alaric turned to her, his silver eyes blazing with 1,000 unsaid words. "No, I forbid it. I will protect you." The emotions flooded her through the bond, a tidal wave of possessive fury and desperate concern. She met his gaze and sent a feeling back to him, a simple, powerful message of her own. "Trust me." He stared at her, his jaw tight, a war raging within him. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the quiet strength that had first called to him. To deny her now, after she had publicly accepted, would be to strip her of the very agency she had just claimed. It would be to declare her a child, a pet, incapable of her own decisions. It would undermine her more thoroughly than any of Valerius's accusations. The muscle in his jaw worked. He turned his gaze, now like chips of ice, back to Valerius. "You have invoked the old law. Alaric's voice was a low, deadly growl that promised retribution. "And the queen has accepted. The trial will take place at moonrise. You, Valerius, will remain under guard in the hall. You will witness what you have wrought, and when she emerges victorious, you will be the first to bend your knee to the queen you sought to destroy." He did not wait for an answer. With a sharp, commanding gesture, he dismissed the court. "Leave us." The word was law. The nobles and courtiers scrambled to obey, their retreat a chaotic, whispering flood of silks and leathers. Guards materialized, surrounding a stunned Valerius and forcing him back to his feet, his triumphant smirk finally faltering as he realized his victory had come with a terrible price. He was now the king's prisoner. Within moments, the great hall was empty, save for the two of them on the dais, the servants clearing the tables, and the silent, imposing figure of Marin, who watched them from the shadows. The moment the great doors boomed shut, the mask of command fell from Alaric. He turned to Tessara, his face a storm of fury and fear. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice raw. He didn't shout, it was worse, a controlled, ragged sound that spoke of a desperate, violent restraint. "I have done what a queen must do," she answered, her voice trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. "I have answered a challenge to the throne." "This is not a challenge you needed to answer. It was my fight." He began to pace the dais, a caged wolf, his power a palpable, crackling aura in the air. "The trial of the Moonstone is not a game, Tessara. It is a soul flaying, a relic from a more brutal time, kept only for ceremony. It has not been truly invoked in 500 years. He stopped and faced her, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was firm, but not painful, his desperation bleeding into his touch. "The Moonstone. It doesn't test strength of arm. It tests the spirit. It peels back every layer of your mind, every defense, and forces you to face the darkness within yourself. Your deepest fears, your most profound shames. It shows you everything you believe is unworthy about yourself and commands you to break beneath the weight of it. Many who have faced it, even strong alphas, have been left as mindless, broken shells." He was trying to frighten her, to make her retract her words, but it was too late. His explanation only solidified her resolve. Her greatest shame, her deepest fear, was the very thing they accused her of, being a soft, worthless, unfit Omega. The trial was not a new threat. It was simply giving a name and a shape to the monster she had been fighting her entire life. "Then I will face it," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "I will face it, and I will not break. How can I be your queen if I am afraid of my own reflection?" His hands tightened on her shoulders. "Because your reflection is not the one I fear. It is the lies they have forced you to see." He pulled her against him, a sudden, desperate movement. His arms wrapped around her, crushing her to his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent, as if it were the only air in the world. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against her own. "I feel your fear," he murmured against her skin, his voice thick with a pain that tore at her. The bond between them was a raw, open channel, her quiet terror and his roaring panic mingling into a single, agonizing chord. "It is a cold, sharp thing. Do not do this to prove yourself to them. Their opinions are dust. Do not risk yourself for their sake." She relaxed into his embrace, her hands coming up to rest on his powerful back. "I am not doing this for them," she whispered into his hair. "I am doing this for me, and for you. I will not be the weakness they used to destroy you." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his silver eyes dark with emotion. He saw the unshakable certainty in her gaze and knew he could not sway her. A look of fierce, terrible pride dawned on his face, warring with his fear. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a whisper of a touch that was more potent than any kiss. It was a promise, a prayer, a lament. Then he pulled away, his expression hardening back into that of the king. He held her at arm's length, his gaze intense, pinning her. "Then hear my command," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through her bones. "You will not go into that chamber and shut me out. When the stone shows you its horrors, when it whispers their lies into your soul, you will not face them alone. You will open the bond. You will let me in. Let me see what you see, feel what you feel. Your fear, your pain, your strength. Give it all to me. I will be your anchor in the storm." His words were a revelation. He was not asking to fight for her. He was demanding to fight with her in the only way he could. Before she could answer, Maren stepped forward from the shadows. Her face was grim, her hands holding a simple folded garment of plain white linen. "My king, my queen," she said, her voice imbued with a new somber respect. "It is time to prepare. For the trial, you must be stripped of all artifice. No jewels, no colors, no signs of rank." She held out the white shift. The moonstone must see the soul laid bare. The air in the antechamber was cold and still, heavy with the scent of ancient stone and burning sage. Maren moved with a quiet, ritualistic solemnity, her hands surprisingly gentle as she helped Tessara remove the silver gown. The shimmering fabric pooled at her feet like liquid moonlight, a discarded skin of a life she had barely begun to live. In its place, she donned the plain white shift. It was coarse against her skin, unadorned and humble, a garment that offered no comfort and no pretense. Stripped of the royal colors, she felt profoundly, terrifyingly herself. Just Tessara, the Omega, the woman who had to prove she was a queen. Maren's stern face was etched with a concern that transcended her role as a servant. "The king's command is a wise one," she said, her voice low as she braided Tessara's hair into a single thick plait down her back. "Do not try to bear the stone's judgment alone. It feeds on solitude. It magnifies the secrets you keep, even from yourself." She paused, her fingers stilling in Tessara's hair. "The legends say the moonstone is a fragment of the fallen moon, a piece of her soul given to us so we might know our own. It is not malicious, but it is unyielding. It shows only truth. You must not fight what it shows you. You must accept it, and then prove it does not define you." Her words were a strange comfort, a map for the treacherous territory Tessara was about to enter. Accept it. She had spent a lifetime running from the truth of what others thought of her. Perhaps the only way through was to turn and face it head-on. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. When the preparations were complete, Alaric entered the antechamber. He, too, had changed. He wore simple black trousers and a loose-fitting tunic, stripped of all armor and adornment save for the faint silver scars that marked his skin. His presence filled the small room, a vortex of contained power and raw anxiety. His eyes met Tessara's, and the world outside them ceased to exist. Through the bond, she felt his fierce, desperate love, a burning current that was both a comfort and a weight. It was the prize and the price, all at once. He walked to her and took her hands. They were cold, and he chafed them between his own, trying to impart some of his warmth. "I will be outside the door," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur meant only for her. "I will not leave. When you are ready, open the bond. I will be waiting." He leaned in and pressed his lips to her forehead, a searing, reverent touch. It was a brand of faith, a final, silent prayer. Then he stepped back, his expression a mask of regal calm for the guards who opened the heavy stone door behind her. Tessara took a deep breath and stepped across the threshold alone. The door boomed shut, the sound echoing with a terrible finality. The chamber was circular, carved from the very bedrock of the mountain upon which the fortress was built. There were no windows, no torches. The only light came from the center of the room, a soft, ethereal, pearlescent glow that pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, like a sleeping heart. It emanated from the moonstone. It was larger than she had imagined, a great ovoid monolith of luminous, milky white crystal, easily as tall as she was. It rested on a low, circular dais of black obsidian that seemed to drink the light, making the stone appear to float in the darkness. The air was cold, yet the light from the stone was not. It was a living radiance, bathing her in a gentle, inquisitive warmth. As she drew closer, she could hear a faint, high-pitched hum, a vibration that resonated deep in her bones, in her teeth. It was the sound of immense dormant power. She remembered Maren's words. "Do not fight what it shows you." She walked to the dais, and following an instinct she didn't know she possessed, placed her hands flat against the moonstone's cool, impossibly smooth surface. The moment her skin made contact, the world dissolved. The soft hum became a deafening roar in her mind. The gentle light exploded into a blinding silver-white supernova that consumed her senses. She was no longer in the stone chamber. She was nowhere. She was adrift in a sea of pure sensation, a consciousness without a body. And then the whispers began. They were the voices of her past, amplified, distorted, made monstrous, the sneering voices of the other she-wolves from her pack. Look at her, so sunk her hips are too wide for a proper huntress. She is built like a broodmare, but she can't even do that. The cruel, dismissive tone of Valerius, barren, worthless, a drain on our resources. Every insult, every sidelong glance of pity, every quiet rejection she had ever endured swirled around her, a tempest of shame. Then the visions started. She saw herself as a young girl, watching the other pups shift for the first time, their sleek, powerful wolf forms emerging with ease. She saw her own agonizing, failed attempt, the searing pain that produced not a wolf, but only a weak, half-formed creature that whimpered and collapsed, its bones not strong enough to hold a true wolf's shape. The memory, buried for years, was now terrifyingly real. She felt the burning humiliation, the disappointment in her parents' eyes. She was flawed, broken from the start. The vision shifted. She was standing in the great hall again, but this time it was worse. The nobles were not whispering. They were laughing, a chorus of open, howling mockery. Alaric was on his throne, but his face was cold, his silver eyes filled with disgust. An Omega Queen? His voice boomed in her mind. A terrible perversion of his true self. You thought you could stand beside me? Look at yourself. You are nothing but a fat, barren cow. You have shamed my court. You have shamed my name. The pain was a physical thing, a blade twisting in her soul. Tears streamed down her face in the real world, her body trembling against the cold stone. This was what she had always feared. This was the truth she held in the deepest, most secret part of her heart. That she was unworthy. That Alaric's acceptance was a mistake, a delusion of the bond that would inevitably fade, leaving her exposed and hated. Break, the stone seemed to whisper. You know this is the truth. Surrender to it. She felt her spirit begin to fracture, the will to fight draining out of her. The shame was a poison, and it had been in her veins for a very long time. Then, through the cacophony of pain and despair, a new voice cut through. Tessara, Alaric, she had forgotten his command. Lost in the storm, she had forgotten her anchor. With a supreme act of will, she focused on his name, on the memory of his touch, the promise in his eyes. Alaric, help me. She threw the gates of the bond wide open. The connection slammed into place with the force of a physical impact. Suddenly, she was not alone in the swirling chaos. She felt his consciousness merge with hers, a solid, unshakable presence. He did not try to fight the visions or silence the voices. Instead, he simply held her, a bulwark of silent, absolute strength against which the storm of her insecurities crashed and broke. I am here, his thought echoed in her mind. Not a voice of words, but of pure feeling. I see it, I feel it. It is a lie. Through his eyes, through the bond, she saw the visions again, but they were different now. He showed her the memory of her failed shift, but where she saw weakness, he saw something else. He saw a young she-wolf whose human half was so strong, so compassionate, that it refused to be fully consumed by the predator. He showed her the mockery of the court, and through his senses she felt not contempt, but a profound, weary disgust for them, for their blindness, their cruelty, their inability to see the true strength that stood before them. And then he showed her the vision of himself on the throne, speaking those monstrous words, but he overlaid it with his own memory, the truth of that moment. He let her feel the electric jolt of the bond snapping into place, the primal, possessive roar of his wolf recognizing its mate, the sudden, overwhelming certainty that the years of waiting were finally over. He had not seen a soft, unfit Omega. He had seen a survivor. He had seen his destiny. He had seen his queen. The lies of the Moonstone, powerful as they were, could not stand against the raw, unyielding truth of the mating bond. The horrifying visions began to fray at the edges, the jeering voices fading to whispers. It is not enough, the stone seemed to murmur, its power coiling for one final assault. It could not break her with shame, so it would try to break her with fear. The world shifted again. She was standing in a barren gray landscape, under a sick, yellow sky. The air smelled of rot and decay. The withered lands, this was the blight the prophecy spoke of. Before her stood a twisted, corrupted version of Valerius, his eyes glowing with a malevolent green light, his form no longer fully wolf, but something other, and behind him stood a broken, defeated Alaric, bound in black chains, his silver eyes dull and lifeless. "You have failed," the corrupted Valerius hissed, his voice the sound of grinding stone. "Your weakness has doomed him. The prophecy was a lie, or you were not the one. Because of you, the North has fallen." The despair that washed over her was 1,000 times worse than the shame. This was her deepest fear realized. Not that she was unworthy, but that her unworthiness would be the ruin of the man she was beginning to love, the kingdom she was meant to save. This was a truth she could not deny, a price she could not bear to pay. But Alaric's presence was still there, a steady flame in the darkness. "Look closer, my heart," he urged her. "Look past the fear. What do you see?" She forced herself to look. At the chains on Alaric, at the corrupted form of Valerius, at the dying land, and she saw it. A faint golden light pulsed from her own hands. The scent of rain-soaked earth and wild heather, her own true scent, was a stark contrast to the stench of decay. The blight recoiled from it, from her. She was not the weakness. She was the cure. "I am not the one who fails," Tessara said, her voice a whisper in the vision, but a roar in her soul. She looked the monster in the eye, and for the first time, she felt no fear. "I am the one who ends you." She stepped forward, and the golden light flared from her hands, from her very being. It was the light of life, of healing, of a queen claiming her power. The vision shattered. She was back in the chamber, her hands against the moonstone. The stone was no longer pulsing with a cold, inquisitive light. It was glowing with a warm, brilliant, golden radiance, the light of her own spirit reflected back at her. The high-pitched hum had deepened into a resonant, harmonious chord. It was a sound of acceptance, of acknowledgement. She had been weighed, she had been measured, and she had not been found wanting. Slowly she took her hands from the stone. The great door to the chamber swung open, flooding the room with the torchlight of the outside world. Alaric stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with awe and a fierce, burning pride. He had seen it all. Tessara walked toward him, out of the darkness and into the light. She did not feel like the Omega who had entered the chamber. She did not even feel like a queen. She felt like herself, whole and unbroken, for the very first time. The torchlight of the corridor felt harsh and alien, after the ethereal glow of the moonstone's chamber. Tessara blinked, her eyes adjusting, her senses slowly returning to the physical world. Her body ached with a profound exhaustion, yet her spirit felt lighter than it ever had, scoured clean by the trial's fire. She saw the raw relief and blazing pride on Alaric's face, and it was a balm to her soul. He met her at the threshold, his hands reaching for her. Not to support her, but to simply touch, to reassure himself that she was real, that she was whole. His fingers wrapped around her arms, his touch gentle, reverent. "Tessara." He breathed, his voice rough with emotion. The bond between them was a placid, sun-warmed sea after the raging storm, a silent, perfect understanding flowing between them. He had seen her deepest vulnerabilities, her most secret shames, and he was still there. He had not turned away. "I'm all right," she whispered. And the words were true, more than all right. She was transformed. Behind Alaric, Marin stood with a thick, fur-lined cloak. The older she-wolf's stern face was cracked with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. Her eyes, which had once held reserved judgment, now shone with a fierce loyalty. She stepped forward and draped the heavy cloak over Tessara's shoulders, the warmth a welcome comfort against the chill of the stone. "The stone chose," Marin murmured, her voice filled with a reverence Tessara had never heard from her. "The prophecy is true. All hail the queen." It was the first time someone other than Alaric had named her so with genuine belief. The words didn't feel like a costume anymore. They felt like a mantle she had earned. Alaric kept one arm wrapped securely around her as he led her from the antechamber. He was her anchor, but she was no longer adrift. She was walking beside him, a partner, not a ward. They moved through the torchlit corridors, the guards they passed dropping to one knee, their faces no longer impassive masks, but shields for their astonishment. The news, it seemed, traveled faster than they could walk. The The very stones of the fortress seemed to buzz with it. The Omega had survived the trial of the Moonstone. They did not return to the royal chambers. Alaric led her directly back toward the great hall. A knot of apprehension tightened into Sarah's stomach. She had faced the demons of her own mind, but now she had to face the ones in the court. "They are waiting," Alaric said, his voice a low growl beside her ear. "They will see you now, not as I have commanded them to, but as you have proven you are." As they approached the massive doors, the low murmur of the reassembled court could be heard from within. The guard swung the doors open, and a hush fell over the hall. Every single noble, courtier, and warrior was there, their faces turned toward the entrance. In the center of the room, still flanked by royal guards, stood Valerius. His face was a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. He had sent her to her doom, and she had returned wrapped in the king's embrace, carrying the aura of the Moonstone's blessing like a shield. Alaric led her to the dais, but he did not ascend. He stopped at the foot of the steps, turning with her to face the assembly, presenting them as a united front. Tessara stood tall, the fur cloak draped around her simple white shift, her gaze steady, her spirit unbowed. She met the eyes of the courtiers who had mocked her, the nobles who had whispered behind their hands. She saw not hatred or scorn now, but a confusing mixture of fear, shock, and a grudging, undeniable respect. She had done what none of them, for all their pride and power, would have dared to do. Alaric's voice boomed through the hall, imbued with the absolute authority of the Alpha King. "You have borne witness to the invocation of the old law. The trial of the Moonstone has been answered." He let his gaze sweep across the room, pinning each and every one of them. "The stone has judged her. It has found her worthy. It has found her queen." He turned his piercing silver gaze upon Valerius. "The challenger will now fulfill his part of the law. You will be the first to show fealty." Valerius stared, his face ashen. He was trapped. The law he had so cleverly used against them was now his own cage. He looked at Tessara, at the woman he had tried to break, and saw not a soft Omega, but an immovable object. The golden light of the Moonstone's blessing still seemed to cling to her, an aura of power that made his wolf shrink back in submission. His ambition, his hatred, his pride, it all crumbled to dust in the face of her quiet, unshakable victory. Slowly, his body trembling with the effort of swallowing his pride, Valerius dropped to one knee. The sound of his armor clanking against the marble floor echoed in the dead silence. He bowed his head, his eyes fixed on the stone at Tessara's feet. "My queen," he choked out, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "I pledge my fealty." It was the crack in the dam. One by one, then in a great rushing wave, the entire court followed his lead. Nobles, warriors, courtiers, they all sank to their knees, a forest of bowed heads before her. The sound was a rumbling wave of metal, leather, and fabric, a testament to a shift in power so profound it was palpable. They were no longer kneeling to the king's command. They were kneeling to her, to the Omega who had faced the darkness and emerged with the light of the moon in her soul. Tessara stood there, Alaric's hand a warm, solid presence on her back, and looked out over the sea of bowed heads. She felt a swell of emotion so powerful, it threatened to overwhelm her, not triumph, not pride, but a deep aching sense of responsibility. These were her people now. Their fears, their hopes, their lives were tied to her. The prophecy was no longer a story. It was her duty. Alaric leaned close, his lips brushing her ear. "Say the words," he murmured, his voice a low, encouraging rumble. "Accept them." She took a breath, finding the voice that the Moonstone had shown her she possessed. "I accept your fealty," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the hall. "Rise as subjects of your queen." As they rose, a new order settled over the great hall. The power dynamic had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer just Alaric's mate, a controversial choice. She was a power in her own right, sanctioned by the most ancient and sacred law of their people. Later that night, in the quiet of the king's chambers, the weight of the day finally descended. The fire crackled in the hearth, a comforting sound against the howl of the wind outside the balcony doors. Tessara sat on a plush fur rug, leaning back against Alaric's chest as he sat on the floor behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. The simple physical contact was more comforting than any words. The fur-lined cloak was draped over both of them, a shared blanket against the cold. "I was so afraid," he confessed. his voice a low vibration against her back. "When I felt your terror through the bond. When the stone showed you those things. It took every ounce of my will not to tear that door from its hinges." "But you didn't," she said softly, turning her head to look at him. "You trusted me." "I trust you," he corrected, his silver eyes intense. "I do not trust ancient rituals or prophecies. I trust the strength I saw in you the moment you defied Valerius for that pup. That is the woman who walked into the chamber. That is the queen who walked out." His unwavering faith in her, in who she was beyond the prophecy, was the most precious gift he could have given her. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not born of passion or of the bond's frantic heat, but of a deep, profound intimacy, forged in shared adversity. It was a kiss of equals, of partners. When they broke apart, a serious, troubled look had settled on his face. Valerius bent the knee, he said, his voice grim. But I saw his eyes. Submission is not in his nature. He is not defeated. He is merely plotting a new attack. Tessara nodded, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "The moonstone showed me a vision of him. He was corrupted, twisted. His eyes were green." Alaric's arms tightened around her. "The blight," he breathed, a look of dawning horror on his face. "The seers spoke of it as a poison of the soul before it is a poison of the land. It preys on ambition, on resentment, on hatred. It offers power to those who are willing to sacrifice their nature for it." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a new, terrible understanding. "The trial wasn't just a test of your worth. It was a warning. Valerius is not just a rival anymore. He may be the first sign of the darkness we are fated to fight." The prophecy was no longer a distant threat. It was here. It had a name and a face. And the price of their victory in the hall was the dawn of a new, more dangerous war. The fight for her legitimacy was over. The fight for their kingdom was just beginning. The days that followed the trial were a strange, breathless calm before an unseen storm. The court's demeanor had transformed. Open hostility had been replaced by a wary, watchful respect. Tessara was no longer a curiosity or an object of scorn. She was an enigma, a source of power they did not understand and therefore feared. Marin had become her shadow, a loyal and surprisingly fierce guardian, instructing her in the intricate protocols of the court, the lineage of the noble houses, and the histories of the northern territories. Tessara absorbed it all, her mind, once occupied with the small worries of an Omega, now expanding to encompass the needs of a kingdom. Her relationship with Alaric deepened into a quiet, powerful rhythm. They were rarely apart. He brought her to his council meetings, where grizzled, scar-faced alphas from the surrounding packs reported on border skirmishes and harvest yields. At first, they had addressed only him, their gazes sliding past her, but Alaric would not answer until they looked at her, until they acknowledged her presence as his equal. "The Queen asked you a question, Lord Sorathin," he would say, his voice mild but with an underlying steel that brooked no argument. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to include her, to see that her questions were not frivolous, but insightful. She saw the patterns they missed, how a poor harvest in the east might be linked to reports of strangely aggressive wildlife from the south, how a pack's sudden silence could be more dangerous than a declaration of war. Her Omega senses, long suppressed, were attuned to the subtle emotional currents of the pack, and she was learning that a kingdom was simply the largest pack of all. Valerius had been stripped of his title and confined to his provincial holdings under the watchful eye of the king's most trusted warriors. He was officially disgraced, his power broken. Yet Tessara could not shake the chill of the Moonstone's vision. She felt his presence like a festering wound on the edge of her awareness, a darkness gathering just beyond the horizon. Alaric sent scouts to the borders of the withered lands, but they returned with unsettling, inconclusive reports. The land was gray and dying, as it had always been, but the blight seemed active. The line of decay was advancing, slowly, imperceptibly, poisoning streams and sickening the ancient trees that stood as sentinels. One evening, as a cold, biting wind howled outside the fortress, Alaric stood before a vast map of the territories pinned to the wall of his solar. Tessara watched him, her heart aching at the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. He carried the weight of the coming darkness on his shoulders, and she felt a fierce, desperate need to help him bear it. "The reports are worsening," he said without turning around, his voice a low, grim rumble. Packs on the southern fringe are reporting pups born, wrong, weak, some wolfless. The healers have no explanation. They say the life force of the land itself is weakening. It's the blight, she whispered, coming to stand beside him. She placed her hand on his back, feeling the tense muscle beneath his tunic. He finally turned, his silver eyes dark with worry. It is, and Valerius is out there, festering in his resentment. He is the perfect vessel for this corruption. He took her hands, his grip tight. The prophecy said you would heal the land, but it did not say how. We are fighting a shadow, Tessara. How do we fight a poison in the soil? The answer came to her then, not as a thought, but as a deep primal instinct rising from the core of her being. It was the echo of the moonstone's trial, the memory of the golden light that had flared from her hands. It was the power she had not known she possessed. We don't fight it from here, she said, her voice filled with a sudden, unshakable certainty. This isn't a war that can be won with armies. You said it yourself. It's a poison of the soul. It must be healed from the source. She looked at him, her gaze clear and resolute. I have to go to the withered lands. Alaric recoiled as if she had struck him. No, he said, the word a flat, absolute command. It's a death sentence. The blight leeches life. No shifter who has ventured deep into its heart has ever returned. I will not allow it. I will not lose you. You won't lose me, she insisted, her grip on his hands tightening. Don't you see? It won't harm me. The moonstone showed me, my scent, my nature. It is the antidote. The prophecy wasn't just about my station as queen. It was about what I am. Life. That is my cure, Alaric. You must let me use it. A terrible, furious war raged in his eyes. The king, the strategist, the leader of his people, knew she was right. It was the only logical, strategic path forward. But the mate, the alpha whose entire world was now wrapped around her safety, roared in silent, violent protest. I will go with you, he stated, a compromise torn from his soul. She shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. You can't. Your power is of command, of strength, of the North's unyielding heart. You must remain here, to hold the line. If you leave, the kingdom is vulnerable. This is a journey I must make alone. She saw the protest forming on his lips, and pressed her fingers to them. Not alone, she amended softly. You will be with me, always. She touched her heart, then his. Through the bond, you will be my anchor, just as you were during the trial. The argument lasted for hours, a battle of wills between two sovereigns, two mates, but in the end, her quiet certainty won out against his fierce, protective rage. He saw the truth in her words, the undeniable logic of her destiny. To keep her caged in the fortress would be to let their kingdom die. The departure was quiet, undertaken at dawn 3 days later. Only a select few knew. Marin prepared a pack for her with a warrior's efficiency and a mother's care, her lips pressed into a thin, worried line. Alaric selected a dozen of his elite royal guard, the silent, deadly wolves known as the Shadow Pack, to escort her to the border. Their commander, a hulking, silent alpha named Darion, with eyes like chips of flint, bowed to her with a new, profound respect. At the gates of the fortress, with the rising sun painting the snow-capped peaks in hues of rose and gold, she said her farewell to Alaric. There were no words left to say. He simply pulled her into a crushing embrace, his face buried in her hair, breathing her in. Through the bond, she felt his terror, his love, his faith. A tumultuous sea of emotion that threatened to drown her. I will feel you every step of the way, he sent to her, a silent, binding vow. Do not shut me out. Not for a moment. Never, she promised back. He let her go, his hands lingering on her arms for a long moment before he stepped back, his face once more the impassive mask of the king. He had to be strong for his people. She had to be strong for their future. The journey south was a descent from life into creeping death. They rode through lush, snow-dusted forests of pine and birch, across frozen rivers and through valleys where the air was crisp and clean. But with each passing day, the land grew more desolate. The trees became stunted and leafless, their branches like skeletal fingers, clawing at the gray sky. The snow gave way to barren, cracked earth, and the silence was unnerving. There were no birds, No scurrying animals, no signs of life. On the 5th day, they reached the edge of the blight. It was not a gentle transition, but a stark, ugly line drawn across the landscape. On one side, the struggling but still living forest of the north. On the other, the gray, soul-sucking wasteland of the withered lands. The air itself felt different, thin and tasting of dust and decay. The guards' wolves grew restless, whining and pacing, their instincts screaming at them to flee. Commander Darion approached her, his face grim. "My queen, we can go no further. The blight weakens our kind. Our orders are to see you to the border and ensure your safety." Tessara dismounted, her boots sinking into the lifeless gray soil. "You have done your duty, Commander. Return to the king. Tell him I have begun." She turned and faced the wasteland alone. It stretched before her, a vista of unending gray under a perpetually overcast sky. It was a land without hope. She took a breath, steeling herself, and took her first step across the threshold. The effect was immediate and nauseating. A wave of profound despair and weakness washed over her, a spiritual poison that sought to leach the very life from her bones. It was a magnified version of the despair the moonstone had shown her, and for a moment she staggered, her vision swimming. Tessara, Alaric's presence slammed into her mind through the bond, a lifeline of pure, unyielding strength. "I am here, anchor to me." She clung to his mental presence, drawing on his power. The nausea receded, the wave of despair breaking against the shield of their bond. She took another step, then another. The blight pressed in on her, a constant, crushing spiritual pressure. But with Alaric as her anchor, she could withstand it. And then she noticed something extraordinary. Where her boots had touched the dead soil, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift was occurring. The gray dust seemed to darken, to gain a hint of richness. A faint, ghostly scent of rain-soaked earth, her scent, lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the smell of decay. She was not just resisting the blight, she was healing it, one step at a time. A new strength, born of purpose, flooded her. This was her destiny. This was her reign. Not on a throne of obsidian, but here, on the dying earth. She began to walk, her steps sure and steady, heading toward the dark, corrupted heart of the blighted lands, where she knew a final confrontation awaited. She did not look back. She walked forward into the gray, a lone queen carrying the seed of a new spring within her. 5 years. It had been 5 years since the day Tessara walked into the gray wasteland, and Alaric had been forced to let her go. 5 years of holding a kingdom together with iron will and a heart stretched thin across 1,000 miles. He had ruled, he had fought, he had maintained the long watch, his every waking moment a silent conversation with the woman who held his soul in her hands. The first year had been agony. Through the bond, he felt her constant, grinding battle against the blight's despair. He felt her exhaustion, her loneliness, her unwavering resolve. He anchored her through storms of spiritual poison, lent her his strength when hers flagged, and in return she sent him back ripples of her progress, the scent of damp earth where there had only been dust, the feeling of a single stubborn blade of grass pushing through cracked soil, the faint distant sound of birdsong returning to a silent land. The kingdom had watched, holding its breath. The healing of the land was a slow, creeping miracle. It began at the border and moved south, a tide of life reclaiming what had been lost. Green followed in Tessara's footsteps, a vibrant, undeniable wave. The blight, which had advanced for generations, was now in full retreat. The southern pack sent emissaries, no longer with reports of sickness and fear, but with tributes of the first harvest from restored soil and news of healthy, strong pups being born. They called her the Moon Queen, the Life-Bringer. Her story became a legend whispered around hearth fires, a promise of hope in the darkest of nights. Alaric had visited the border only once, a year into her journey. He had stood on the edge of the revitalized forest and looked out at the still gray lands beyond. He could not cross. His very nature, so tied to the unyielding strength of the north, was anathema to the delicate healing she wove. But he could feel her, a steady golden light in the distance, and he had seen the proof of her power in the emerald green grass at his feet. It had been enough. Now, on the 5th anniversary of her departure, a strange, expectant energy filled the fortress. The blight had been pushed back to the sea. The withered lands were no more. They were now called the Queen's Fields. Reports had come that the final corruption had been cleansed, the last vestiges of its poison washed away by the tides. She was coming home. Alaric stood on the highest rampart of the fortress, the same place he had watched her ride away. The wind was cold, but it carried the scent of thawing earth and the promise of spring. He had not slept. He had watched the eastern road since moonset, his heart a frantic, hopeful drum in his chest. And then he saw them. A small procession cresting the final hill. At its head was a rider on a white mare, her hair unbound, a river of dark silk against a cloak of deep forest green. His breath caught in his throat. The bond, which had been a constant, steady hum for 5 years, now blazed to life with an incandescent, overwhelming joy. It was her. He did not wait. He did not care for ceremony or for the dignity of a king. He turned and descended the tower stairs, his long legs eating the distance, his boots echoing on the stone. He burst out into the main courtyard, just as the procession was passing through the great gates. The guards, the servants, the courtiers, they all dropped to their knees as she passed. A wave of silent, reverent awe. Tessara slid from her horse, her eyes finding his across the crowded yard. The 5 years had changed her. The softness was still there, in the gentle curve of her hips, but it was overlaid with a profound, quiet strength. Her face was leaner. Her eyes held the ancient wisdom of one who has walked through the valley of death and brought back life. She was no longer just the Omega, who had survived a trial. She was a force of nature. She was every inch the queen she had been born to be. They met in the center of the courtyard, the world falling away around them. He reached for her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones as if to assure himself she was real. She was more real than anything. She leaned into his touch, her hands coming to rest on his chest, over his heart. "Alaric," she whispered, and his name was a prayer, a homecoming. "I felt you," he murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears, "every step." "I know," she said, her smile radiant enough to banish the last of the winter chill. "I was never alone." He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that held 5 years of longing, of fear, of unwavering faith, and of a love that had healed a kingdom. The court remained on their knees, silent witnesses to the reunion of their sovereigns, the Alpha King and the Omega Queen, who had saved them all. That night they stood on the balcony of their chambers, the northern star, the brightest in the squall gleaming above them. The world was quiet, at peace. "Valerius?" Alaric asked, the first time either of them had spoken the name. "Gone," Tessara said simply. When the last of the blight was cleansed, he was at its heart. There was nothing left of him to corrupt. He just faded, like a shadow in the sun. There was no triumph in her voice, only a deep, somber pity. He pulled her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her, breathing in the familiar, beloved scent of rain-soaked earth and wild heather. "It's over." "It's beginning," she corrected softly, placing her hand over his on her belly. He stilled, his breath catching. Through the bond he felt it, a tiny nascent spark of life, a new heartbeat, a new promise. It was a life forged not of a brutal alpha nature, but of a perfect balance, the unyielding strength of the north and the life-giving soul of the south. An heir. He turned her in his arms, his silver eyes shining with a light brighter than any star. He saw it all in her gaze. His mate, his queen, the mother of his child, the savior of his kingdom. She was the soft-spoken Omega, who had walked into his hall as a joke. She was the northern star that had guided them all home.